Put that in there.
Only one more.
We have only two.
They only have the one more.
Basically.
How are you? Good, good.
Probably here.
Hey Dan, for some reason it's not going. I don't see it on my cell phone. Do you see it? Works here.
How many books do I sell? That's the only thing that means something.
We had a member by the name of Shirley Webb. She was a very delightful person. I once worked with her at a fair where I sat next to her selling books. And unfortunately, recently she died. And her daughter, does anybody know Shirley Webb in here?
I didn't know her well.
You know her well?
I said I didn't know her well, but I knew who she was.
But you know the name.
I'll put
It's
that.
interesting how she sold books.
That says work in
because
progress.
She wrote books about Indians. She was from, she had Native inheritance. And as a result, she would write children's books about Indians. And she would go to a school and she would ask the principal to send letters to the parents asking if she could come to their school, and if they wanted to buy her books, they could give money to their children the day she was going to be there. So she would have 4 or 5 classes waiting for her when she went to a school, and she would sell her books that way. And she was very successful doing it too.
She gave us a great talk at CAPA once, I remember that.
She what?
She gave us a talk at a CAPA meeting.
I think she did.
Yeah,
I
I
think
was
she
there,
did.
it was great.
I think she talked here once, as I recall. There are a couple of people, but I don't think they're here tonight, that won books which we give out. First of all, does everybody know about the newsletter?
I
Do
know.
they get the newsletter? Anybody doesn't? Everybody knows about the newsletter?
Online.
Anybody that doesn't know about the
Do
newsletter?
you email it to us?
I'm sorry?
Do you email it to us?
Yes.
Okay, then I guess I did.
Have you received one?
Yeah, there's an old guy talking right now.
Have you received
No,
one?
I'm talking on the screen. and stuff.
Okay, I gotta find out. Has anybody received a newsletter in here? 1, 2. Anybody else? 3. Okay, if you have not received a newsletter, let me know, because in that newsletter, it's very interesting information. There's a lot of information for you, and we have a contest. And tonight, 2 of those people who won the
Yeah, that's-
contest,
Okay.
unfortunately, have
All right,
not
thanks,
showed
man.
up. So we have 2 books for them. And also some other goodies in that newsletter too, so I hope you do. Tonight, we have a fascinating speaker, and his name is Matthew Dix, and he has quite a reputation for storytelling. And in fact, he's developed a method of showing other people how to do the same thing he does. He has managed to grow, talking about, and I think I better read this with my glasses, because if I don't use my glasses, I can't read this at all. But what he has done, he's managed to grow his readership and supporters by telling stories about himself, his career. Now, this man is an internationally best-selling author of many novels, and also he's what they call a Moth Story Slam champion of 6 times, and a Grand Slam champion, and this is about live storytelling in New York City. So he's going to be able to tell you about that, but I think what you're going to learn is something about how to, or new ideas, talking about yourself rather than talking about your books, selling yourself. And I think it's a marvelous idea. So without further ado, I want to introduce author Matthew Dix. Thank you, Matthew.
Setting a timer for myself so I don't talk forever. Thanks for being here. So I guess what I'm going to talk about tonight a little bit is the idea of getting yourself off the page and onto the proverbial stage of some sorts. I've been publishing since 2009, my first book was published, and since then I've published, my 5th novel comes out next month, and I have a book of nonfiction. And when I started publishing books, I guess for whatever reason, I think it's probably a combination of arrogance, narcissism, and stupidity all woven into this blanket that is me, I decided that I should talk about myself rather than my books. I had attended a lot of author talks for years. I was an English major and I wanted to write novels long before anyone wanted to actually read my novels. So I would go to every author talk I could go to. And when I saw these authors speak, they usually did one of 2 things. One was they would read their book to us and then take a few questions. And I just don't think anyone should ever do that. I don't think you should ever read a single word out of your book to another human being. That is not why we write books. That is not really why anyone comes to see you, I promise you. No one has ever gone to an author in hopes that they will read to them. That is long past, our time. Sometimes authors will, instead of reading directly from their book, they will talk a lot about their book. And I attended a lot of those author talks too. And so I would basically know everything about the book before I ever read the book, and then I felt like I didn't really need to read the book anymore because I got the sense of what the book was about. And so I knew I didn't want to do that either. And so when I started talking about my books, even before I started standing on stages around the world and telling stories and doing the things that I do, I talked about myself. I sort of had this fundamental belief that I think has worked well for me, that I don't want to sell a book, I want to sell myself. I want people to get to know and like me so that every time I have something that I am making, they will be interested in that thing that I'm making. Because if I'm selling a book, if you don't like the next book, you're really not going to buy it. Or if you discover that I'm writing for a magazine, but you don't typically read that magazine, you're not going to buy it. But if you fundamentally feel connected to me in some way, if you get to know me and you feel like the things that I make are interesting to you, then it doesn't really matter what I make. You'll continue to come back and see it again and again. And I know that's true for my authors, the people that I love, whether it's actually an author or someone who makes content for the radio, musicians. Springsteen puts out a new album. I don't wait to hear Springsteen describe his songs to me and let me know the thought process that went into the album. I'm in on Bruce Springsteen. Anything he makes, whether it was his book or whether it's songs, I'm going to purchase and I'm going to consume. And so that's a lofty goal, but I want you to become the Bruce Springsteen of your small literary world. I want people to understand that when you make something, we need to go get that thing that that person made because we feel connected to them. And the way I did that was telling stories about myself. And I'll be a little specific about it tonight, but I really do believe that if you talk about yourself in a meaningful way, in a vulnerable, authentic, purposeful way, people will feel connected to you, and suddenly they'll want to hear more from you. My favorite example, it just happened in New York maybe 6 months ago. I told a story on a stage. Just a story about my life, a vulnerable moment when I was speaking at MIT. I was teaching physicists how to tell stories, and I walked into a women's bathroom, into a bunch of physicists, ladies who were peeing, and then I had another awkward moment with another man. It was a series of misadventures that ended up in a lovely little story. It wasn't anything profound, it was just me sort of speaking vulnerably about how stupid I can be while surrounded by people much smarter than me. And when I stepped off the stage, a woman came up to me and she grabbed me. People are always, they touch me all the time. When you start telling stories, what happens is you get this odd one-sided relationship with people where they know everything about you and you know nothing about them. And so she grabbed me and she pulled me really close. Before even saying a word to me, without introducing herself, she said to me, "Every time I go into someone's house, even my mother's house, I have to steal something." Right? And then she pulled me in really close and she said, "I've never told anyone that before." Right? Now, she's going to buy my books if she figures out that I'm an author, right? Now,
Just to keep me quiet.
she might have not known that she probably did know I was an author that night because I was telling a story for The Moth or some organization in New York, I don't remember who, but I was on a stage. But if she had known I was an author, I bet she would go and buy my books. And I'm a columnist for a couple magazines, and if she knew that, I bet she would be reading my columns, or she would find out that I'm active on Twitter, and she would follow me on Twitter, or I write a blog every day, and if she found that out, she would read my blog every day, at least to find out if I was interesting. And as long as you're interesting, as long as you're saying something of import, as long as you're entertaining, I think that's how we find our people. If you're not interesting, if you have nothing to say, I cannot help you, other than to say it took me a long time to find something to say. I practiced writing for a very, very long time before I found a way to write things that people were interested in hearing. But if you're writing things that are good, if you're writing things that people will be interested in hearing, I think the goal is to get them to like you. To not necessarily to even like you, because I think I'm a fairly unlikable person at times, but I'm a fairly unlikable person who is vulnerable and honest and authentic. And if they feel connected to you in some way, in some deep and meaningful way, I think that's how they get to know you and they get to love you. And then you don't have to worry about plugging the next book. You don't have to worry about whether they're going to like the next story that you wrote. You're not going to have to worry if what you're writing is going to match what their interest level is. Just like Springsteen could put out a jazz album tomorrow and I would listen to it. Springsteen could put out classical music and I would listen to it. It doesn't matter what he puts out, I will absolutely listen to it. And you have those people too, and he's one example of many. I'm a Stephen King fan, and I am here to tell you, he writes some terrible books. And he would be the first one to tell you that some of his books are terrible. And I'm often terribly disappointed in the work that he produces. And he would say the same thing about it. And yet when he puts out a book, I guarantee you I'm going to read that book. I'm going to purchase it, read it, and perhaps be disappointed in it. But he owns my soul. I believe in him. I believe in him enough. I want to hear what he has to say. Even if the thing he says isn't so great, I'm still going to be in it for the next one. And so that's the goal, is to connect to human beings, to make them believe in you, and to get them to want to read and consume the things that you're making. And so I'll just give you some strategies tonight, some ways that I go about doing that. I have a book coming out in November, so I'm going to talk about that book because I'm going to be doing a launch event soon, and it's a convenient way to talk about it. So the book coming out in November is 21 Truths About Love. It's a book written entirely in lists. It's a novel that it consists of list after list after list after list. And in reading the lists written by a obsessive list maker, both the author and the protagonist are both obsessive list makers, you get the sense of what the story is going to be about. And so in November, I'm going to do a launch event where I gather a bunch of people. I sort of have a theater and I bring together a couple hundred people, and I don't really talk about the contents of the book ever. Sort of, people are going to leave my launch event and really not know what the book is about in many ways, because the stories that I tell about all of my books are not necessarily about what's happening in the book, because I can't imagine why you would want to know what's happening in the book, because that's the purpose of reading the book. Instead, I want you to understand the process of writing the book, or who it was, who I am as the writer of the book, or where the ideas came from in the writing of the book, or the stumbling blocks along the way, or some of the insider publishing secrets that people always want to know that are not as interesting as they think they are, those kinds of things. And so I do a bunch of things when I am preparing to talk about my books. One thing I think you should absolutely have is your origin story. You know, no matter what book is coming out, no matter where I go, I can always tell the story of how I became a writer. And that is often my most successful version of my talk. I don't speak about my book at all. All I do is describe how I became a writer. And part of that is going to be figuring out what that story is and finding the most entertaining way to tell it. But I mean, for me, fortunately, it's when I'm 17 and I'm in a classroom and I have a teacher who I don't like very much who has given me an assignment to write satire. And I think for the first time in my life, I found something interesting. I get to write satire, I get to make fun of other people, is what my 17-year-old version of that is. And I write it, and he gives me a C- on it, and I'm not happy about that. It's also late, that affects the score. And I end up going to war with him in front of the class, and I end up reading it in front of the class. And we make a deal. If the class agrees that it's satire and it's good, he raises my grade. And if they disagree with me, he lowers my grade. You know, it's great. And the class loves it, including him. He admits that it is satire, just it doesn't come across as satire on the page. He says, "You are such a sarcastic person, you managed to bring life to this thing that lies dead on the page." And it's a moment for me. It's the most important moment of my life, maybe, because it's the moment I become a writer. I make girls laugh, which is primarily why I write even to this day. It causes me to feel like I have changed my future in some small way. I've turned a grade, I've improved a grade, and I'm a kid who gets kicked out of his house when he's 18 and becomes homeless. So the idea that writing can somehow change my future is really critical to me. I make a teacher look stupid, which as an elementary school teacher today, I can tell you it doesn't happen very often. They think it happens all the time, but it doesn't really. But that day it did. So I tell that story, and then I go on and I talk about some of my failures and a few of my successes, and I can talk for probably 30 to 45 minutes in an entertaining way about my origin as a writer. And I could just stop right there and never speak about the book, but then say, so I published a new book, it's called 21 Truths About Love. If you're interested in it, you know, you can buy it at a store, wherever it's going to be available that day. And that's just a simple origin story. And it is a big hit, always. And it works everywhere. It's if I'm asked to speak at a high school, if I'm asked to speak at a book club, if I'm asked to speak here, I could have spoken for 45 minutes on my origin story. You would have laughed, you would have been interested. At the end, you would have felt more connected to me, and you would be interested in the things I have to say. I'm sort of a commercial for what is in the book. If I can speak well here, presumably what is going to be in the book is going to be an even better version of that, because it's going to be the edited, carefully crafted version of me on the page. And so I think you have to have that story for sure. You have to have the story of how did I become a writer? Not how did I become a writer of the particular book that I happen to be writing or the story I'm trying to pitch, but how did I become a writer, period? What inspired me? What moments were significant to me? If you can find something humorous, that's really going to help a lot. If you can be honest, if you can speak about failures and you can be vulnerable and talk about things that most people don't talk about, that is what I aggressively try to do. I try to say the things that other people are unwilling to say in front of as many strangers as possible. And that brings people closer to me. And so having that alone, I think, will help you become a much better connector to other people and a way to promote your work. But the other thing I do is I just think about my stories, and so I'm planning stories for this book right now for my launch event, and what I do is I just try to think about the odd things, the unusual things, the interesting things that happen when you write a book, where the idea comes from, what was a moment where sort of everything came together, or you unlock, you know those moments in your books where you unlock something for the first time and you go, that's going to be the thing. I try to find those and I try to tell them as stories. So I'm not going to tell you those stories tonight, but I'll give you examples of things that I'm going to be using at my launch event, which will be stories that are stories I sort of use with all of my novels to one degree or another. We could pull any one of my novels out of this book, out of this bag, and I could tell you that I have basically the same kinds of stories. So there's always the origin story for a book. Where did the idea come from? And people are really interested in that. It's probably the most frequently asked question that I get, with the exception of how did the cover get made? Other than that obsession over the cover, it's where did you get your idea? And you have to know what that's going to be. And you have to have a story behind it. You really do. You have to have something that demonstrates the creative process, or how two ideas fused together at one moment and made the book that is what is before you. And so this is a book that started because I had a terrible principal for 3 years at my school, a man who was recently on the front page of the Hartford Courant, unfortunately for him, for things he did at another school. And he was an awful leader, and he ran awful faculty meetings and awful training sessions. And I often found myself sitting at a desk or at a table with a bunch of my friends, learning nothing and wasting my time. And so, in order to entertain my friends, I began writing lists. The first lists were lists related to education, things like 10 ways that a principal can cause me to want to kill him. Reasons why principals don't deserve their own parking spots, ways that you can make education terrible for both teachers and students, these kinds of lists. And I would write them and I'd pass them around the table as my way of looking both productive, so it would look like I was taking notes in the middle of the meeting and showing my notes to people so that there was no question as to my engagement, while at the same time entertaining my table mates and entertaining myself. And I did that for probably 6 months, just writing amusing lists in faculty meetings and training sessions where the content sort of went awry and nothing pertained to me anymore. And then as I was writing those lists, I started to discover I would pass a list and I'd think, I don't actually think what I just put on that list. Like, that's not me talking. That's weirdly some version of me talking, but not actually me. And so that started happening to the lists. And eventually, the list started coalescing into a bit of a narrative. Not much, but a little bit of a narrative. And then I called my agent and I said, what do you think about a novel written in lists? That would be kind of different, right? And she loved the idea. She thought it was great. And then we pitched it to my editor, and she told me it was a terrible idea, and she would never purchase it, and I should move on to something more interesting. And I was already working on something else. This was sort of one of those side projects that authors often have, the secret book you don't tell your spouse about because you're not supposed to be spending that much time writing, like you promised that you would only spend this much time writing and not that much time. But I kept writing the lists, because I sort of got stuck on writing the lists. And they kept coming together in what was weirdly a story about a guy and his struggles with life and finance and marriage and all of these things. Some of them were coming right from me. Some of them were like things that I really believed and things that I thought, but some of them were not. I was not at the time struggling with my marriage, and I'm still not, honey. But I wasn't struggling with a lot of his struggles. I was creating things. And my editor didn't want the book. My agent was excited about the book, but she said, move on to other things. Let's not write things that don't make us money. And then my agent left the publishing company, which is often a terrible thing for a writer when you lose your editor. My editor left the publishing company, and that's a terrible thing when that happens. It's happened to me a couple times, and it often creates great struggles in your career. But this one worked out really well for me, because my new editor, she said, I heard you have a book that's written only in lists. And I said, well, I have like 40% of a book written only in lists. And she said, well, I'm not going to buy it because I heard it's a terrible idea. She said, I'm curious, I'd like to see it. Send it to me. I'm just curious about what it would look like. And I sent it to her. And 3 days later, she said, we'd like to flip-flop the order of books. The book that I was slated to publish, which will come out now in 2020, she said, we'd like that to be we'd like that to be 2 books away. We'd like this to be your next book. And I said, well, it's not written, it's only 40% done. And she said, yeah, you gotta get going. But that's an origin story about a book, which when I craft it into a much better story, it's the idea of a frustrated teacher who's sitting in meetings that he shouldn't have to sit through and finding a way to occupy himself, and it results in a book. I like that story a lot. I like it not only because it says something about me, but it says something to my audience. Because when we speak to readers, what we really are speaking to is readers who, in some either large part of their soul or a small part of their soul, want to be writers themselves. It's very rare to run into a reader who doesn't think in their head, someday maybe I could be a writer too. Right? There's very few of those people who have no desire to write whatsoever. In fact, I think the people who read books the most, the more books they read, the more likely they are to be someday writers. You know, someday I'd like to write a book. And so I like to speak to those people. And this is the idea that, well, if I can write a book in a faculty meeting, you know, and in some terrible training sessions, like what could you do if you committed to 20 minutes a night for the rest of your life? You know, what could you produce? And so it's a good story for me, but I'm always looking for stories that touch my audience too. Because if I convince my audience that they can be writers too, now I mean something to them. Now I'm the person who inspired them to go home and write that night, right? And if I'm the person who inspired them to go write, they're going to be interested in the stuff that I make. They're probably going to go online and find my Facebook author page and friend me. And when it comes time for me to have a pre-sale on this book and I put those links out into my social media, they're probably going to see it and they're going to go, well, I'm writing 20 minutes a night because of that guy. Maybe I should check out that book that he once mentioned. You know, they're not going to really know about the book. They're not going to know the name of the character of the book. They're not even really going to know the plot of the book. They're just going to know he wrote a book and he inspired me that night. Or even if they're not writing, even if they're like, yeah, he's right, someday I'll do that. You know, that's what most people do in their lives anyway. They walk through lives saying someday they'll do something, and then they die and having done nothing. That is the tragedy of life. Not for you, you're here. You're not someday writers, you're writers. But most people are someday writers, but even then, we inspire them. So I look for stories that speak to me, but also in some way find a way into their hearts and minds. And so I think about people and the potential they have, and I try to spark that potential in the stories that I have. And so an origin story about the book is important. And every one of my books, I can speak for 30 minutes on the origin of each one of my books. And you could too, if you probe and you think and you wonder and you keep track of how these books came about, where the idea came from. If you think about expanding upon those ideas, you'll find an origin story that is worth telling. And I think it's probably, other than your own origin story, the most important story that you can tell about your book. And I encourage you not to include plot, or at least as little plot as possible. I mean, whatever plot is necessary in terms of the origin story makes sense. You know, some of my books you'll learn more about the plot than others and me describing the story. But I try to stay away from that. I try to stay away from characters and themes and things like that, because I don't think that's why people come to talks. I think they come to talks to be entertained. And I don't think offering a book report is a way to entertain anyone. In fact, I think it's a terrible thing. I've tried to get my editors to put on the front of my books, no book reports allowed, right? I have that. When I go to high schools, one of my books is crossed over into the YA market. And I always start my talk by saying, so teachers, I want you to know there's no book reports allowed for any of my books. That's not an assignment you're allowed to give. And I think that's what authors do. I think they go and they give book reports to people who want to learn about what writing is like and what authors are like. And this person who maybe I read one of his books and he seems pretty interesting, I'd like to know something about him, not really something about a character that he once made up in his head. I don't think that's what people are interested in. So an origin story about your book. If you have a story about the title of your book, which I think a lot of books tend to have, I think that's a good story to tell as well. I can tell you an origin story for three of my 5 books have good stories involving their titles. They're not as long as an origin story. This book's original title, for example, was Lists. That's what made sense to me. All of my books are basically the name of my protagonist or something like that. So this was a book called Lists. I thought it was going to be called Lists. I was the only one, it turns out, who thought it was going to be called Lists. If you've dealt with publishers before, you understand that. Silly you. You thought you had control over your title. You usually don't. The title was actually originally 16 Truths About Love, which was a title proposed by my agent, which my editor loved. I pointed out to my agent that that list does not exist within the book. And she said, I know it doesn't, so you have one more list to write. Which I then said, so I have to write the most important list of my book. It has to be 16 truths about love that pertain to this book. And I have to make sure it's worthy of a title. And she said, yes, go do that. And so I did. I produced a list of 16 truths about love, and we submitted it to the publisher. And then the publisher came back to me and said, actually, we want it to be called 21 Truths About Love, because 16 makes it feel like a high school girls book, and 21 makes it feel more grown up. And so not only did the list have to change to 21 Truths, but that's what created the title. And so people often think, titles sort of magically fall into our heads, and, we wake up with grand inspiration. And this was a engineered title created by an agent to an editor to a publisher, back to me writing additional lists for the book. But those are often good stories for people to hear because they always want to know where titles come from. So a title story often really works well. If you happen to have a cover story, that works well too. We often don't have as many of those. This book actually had another cover prior to this one, a cover that I sort of hated but everyone else loved, so I secretly pretended to love it because everyone else loved it. And then the sales force decided they hated it, and then I was a great fan of the sales force. And then I ended up with this cover, which will be a little different. This is an advanced reader's copy of it. The actual cover will be slightly different than this, and even better, I think. But it's a small story, it's a tiny little story. It's probably a 5-minute story about how covers can change and how you feel about the cover, and what participation authors have in covers, which is often none, but occasionally some. Sometimes if you have more than one book, you can bring that in. So like, if at the top, when I'm talking about the title, the cover of the book, I might say, this was my second book, Unexpectedly Milo. And I had great say in this cover because the car was on the wrong side of the road when they sent it to me, and the book was not set in England, so I get to move the car to the correct side of the road. That is about the extent of the participation I had in this title. But that's a lot, considering how much participation I've had in the past with covers. But you can bring in other things that you've done and tie that into a story that you're telling about the book here. But again, you still don't know what my book is about. But I'm able to tell you stories about myself, the origin of the book, the origin of the title, and the origin of the cover. All of those things are coming in. And still, I haven't mentioned the main character or really the plot of the story in any way. And hopefully at this point, if I was telling you full stories, not these abbreviated versions of the stories, you're intrigued enough that you're thinking, what is in that book? Like that he's talking a lot about. And that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for what is in that book, not necessarily, I want to read that book because that man that he's mentioned and his dilemmas sound especially compelling in any way, but I'm teasing the book quite a bit. The other thing I like to find in books whenever possible is a sticking point. And I happen to have a bunch of them, those moments where you're not sure where to go in a book, the moment when you have a problem that you don't know how to solve. I don't know how you write. I write in the dark. I'm just a blind man writing words on a page, and I don't know where the ending of my book is going to be, and so I often run into problems. And my wife has said that her favorite thing about the process that I have in writing is that I write my characters into problems that I can't figure out solutions for a while, and I refuse to change the problem that I've created. I force myself to find a solution through the eyes of the character. And sometimes that means that I take a lot of showers because I do most of my thinking in the shower or while driving. That's where my solutions tend to come. This book hinges on a crime. There's a crime that is committed in this book, and it sort of needed to be the perfect crime. It needed to be a realistic, kind of crime that I might commit and feel like I would have a shot at pulling it off. And truthfully, I could not think of that crime. I was stuck for a very long time on what will the crime of this book be. It just didn't make sense for anyone to commit crime these days if you're a logical person. Just the sheer number of video cameras in the world today, on ATMs and gas stations and highways, I can't imagine why anyone does commit crime. And so I had to think of a crime that was sort of realistic and sort of possible, and the average person would go, yeah, that actually, you could pull that off. That would be a successful way to dangerously steal a lot of money, right? Which is essentially one of the plot points in this book. And the way I solve this problem is a really great story, thankfully. And most of them are. The way I solve this problem is I go to a Patriots game with my brother. A brother who I don't see very often. A brother who I grew up with and we were like this. And then because my parents and our home fall apart, and I get kicked out of my house, and he escapes to the military. And when you don't have a home to return to every Thanksgiving or Christmas, and everyone's sort of poor and desperately trying to, keep food on your own table and keep a car on the road, and nobody can sort of pull themselves up for a long time, you lose that thread. And so my brother and my sister and I, who grew up as close as you possibly could, are now sadly apart. We don't speak as often as we should. We do, but there's just not that closeness we once had because of some disastrous things that happened with our family. But I took my brother to a Patriots game. I'm a season ticket holder. I was just texting my wife, ensuring that she's going to record the game because it starts at 8:20 tonight, and I'll watch it on delay. And I took him to the Patriots game, and while we were sitting there during the third quarter, he said, "What are you working on right now?" Which is the first time he had ever asked me about one of my books in my life. Any of my family members, really. It's the first time they had ever asked about anything that I was doing. And I described this book, and I said, "But I'm stuck, because I got to get this." The book sort of hinges on this crime, and I don't know, I just feel like there's no place to commit crimes anymore. I was thinking about putting in the 1950s when you could rob a bank and not have a camera catch you, or a fingerprint on the door, or get you caught. And my brother said instantly the solution to the problem, as if he had been planning this crime all along. It was incredible. I don't think I'm not going to tell the crime when I tell the story, when I'm actually promoting the book. I don't want to give anything away. It's sort of it's a secret to the book. It's a surprise when it is stumbled upon, the solution to the problem. But I'll tell you because I don't care about you as much. And the book's not available right now, so you can't buy it till November. But my brother said, "Oh, you rob a VFW bingo." He said, "Because they're all old and it's only cash." And I went, "That's brilliant." He goes, "Oh yeah, they have 10 grand, 20 grand at a time. It's just a bunch of old guys smoking, and they all bring $300, and it sits in some metal box at the front of the room, and at the end of the night, some other old guy passes the money out to whoever wins. You go in there, they probably are all armed, so you have to be careful for that. But yeah, you go rob a bingo." He said, "That's the one place where you can still get cash, and there's probably not a lot of cameras going on." And I thought, that's it. That's the solution to my problem. Now, again, I'm probably not going to reveal the bingo idea because it's going to give away a plot point in the book that I don't want to give away to readers. But it's not a story about the book, really. It's a story about a brother who wishes he could be as close to his brother as he used to be. And then one day we'll stay sitting in the stands at a Patriots game. His brother asks him a question about something that is near and dear to his heart that no one else seems to care about in my family. And he gives me the solution to my book. Every time I hold my book, I think of my brother. I don't talk to my brother as often as I should, or I've probably texted him once this month, and he probably texted me back once. He's been living in New Jersey for 3 months, and I was not aware of that. His company had moved him to New Jersey, and now he's moving to New Hampshire. I sort of can't keep track of him and what he's doing and where he's going, and he doesn't seem to want to keep track of me as much. But every time I hold my book, I think about my brother. And I think about that day at the Patriots game when we sat next to each other for 4 hours and watched the Patriots win. But more important, equally as important as the Patriots' victory that day, was the fact that he unlocked the book for me. That the stumbling block that I thought might not allow this book to feel right to me, to feel right to readers, he unlocked it for me. And so it becomes something near and dear to my heart. And anyone in the audience who is estranged in any way, or feeling a little not as close as they should to their sibling or their parent or their aunt or their grandparent, it's going to tug on a heartstring. It's going to mean something to them. And when I mean something to them and I make you feel something real, that is when you feel connected to me. And suddenly the things that I make become important to you. Because as I'm speaking to my audience, I'm making something live right in front of them, right? I'm making a story about my life and my connection to my brother. And now you understand, he makes good things. He made me cry at a book event about my disconnect with my sister and made me go home and call her, right? He made a thing in front of me, so now I want to read the things that he makes on the page as well. And so that's great. And so that's a good story, the stumbling block. And every one of my books has one of those stories. And most of my books, and if you're like me, most of my books have multiple stumbling blocks. And so I pick the ones that I think are the most story-worthy, the ones that I can sort of creep my way into the hearts and minds of my audience, and I tell that story. And those stories tend to be a little longer, because sticking points last a very long time, for me at least. I get hung up on things, and I sort of can't write my way out of a box sometimes, maybe because of the way I write. Like my wife said, I put my characters in impossible dilemmas and then have to find solutions to those. But those tend to be really good stories to tell to audience as well. And then the last story I like to tell is the moment that like your book actually becomes a book. For me, it's always the moment when an offer is made, or the moment I get to tell my wife that the book is sold, or it's the how my life has changed because of my book in some way, in some deep and meaningful way. And so, when I think about my books, I often think like, this is the book that paid for the wedding and put a down payment on the house. And that's always what I think, and that's a good story for people to hear, that like, I had some wedding debt and we didn't know how we were going to buy a house, and then I wrote a book and it made my wife cry in the back hallway of our school when my agent called and said, we're going to sell your book to Doubleday. And I got to find her in the back hall and tell her that the book had sold, and she wept. And then the rumor went through the school that I had dumped her in the back hall of the school. I quickly run around and fix that and say, no, I had not dumped my wife at work. I just told her good news. And this is the book that kept her at home when we had our first child and allowed her to not have to go back to work, And so I can do that with all of my books. I can tell stories about how this book changed my life in some way. And whether your life changes in that you get to put a down payment on the house, or your life changes in that maybe you're a person like Avi, the children's author Avi, whose parents told him he would never be a successful author and he was a fool for going into writing. And the reason he uses the pen name Avi is because he doesn't want his parents' name on his books, because they did not believe in him, right? And so maybe you're the person who didn't have someone believe in you. And the publication of your book is just a great big fat I told you so, which would mean a lot to a lot of people, because saying I told you so, it's basically the 4 best words you can ever say in the English language. And so even if it's as simple as an I told you so, or it's the moment you get to call your parent and say, Mom or Dad, I published a book, and you get to listen to your parents on the end of the phone, all of those things, if told well, will make people laugh and cry, and it'll make everyone want to go try to do the same thing. And through all of the stories I tell about all of the books, the constant message I send to people is I am not a special person. The only difference between me and my readers is I have committed my ass to a chair longer than they have. And their chair is usually more comfortable than mine, because I have to sit up straight and type in a computer, and they can lounge in their chair and read my book. But I do fundamentally believe that everyone can be a writer in some way. And so I'm constantly trying to share myself, connect to my audience, be authentic, while at the same time finding a way to get them to feel differently about themselves. Whether it is I can write, or whether it is I need to call my sister because that guy didn't call his brother for a long time, or whether it is, oh, I once did something and it made me feel good just like he felt good when he published his book. Those are the kinds of stories I think really change people's minds and hearts and connect them to you. And then really remarkable things will happen. I really do credit a lot of my success in publishing through the idea that I've sold myself as a person rather than selling a book. And so when it comes time to sell books, when it comes time for my agent to sort of pitch a book to people, one of my favorite conversations I ever had with her, her name's Taryn, she lives in Washington State, but she comes to the East Coast occasionally, and she stayed at our house one time. And we were in the backyard just sort of watching, I think we were watching my kids play in the backyard and talking about my writing career. I think I was maybe 2 or 3 books into my career. And she said to me, listen, I just need you to know this. And I said, yeah. And she said, don't ever become an asshole. Right? And I said, what do you mean? And she said, it's so much easier to sell your books because you're not an asshole. And through some prodding, I tried to figure out what that was, because I apparently wanted to avoid this pitfall that she was describing. But essentially it was people like you. Like people in the publishing industry, your readers, they just like you as a human being. And it's not because I'm likable. If my wife was here, she would say, yeah, he can be really unlikable at times. I'm not the best human being at all. But what I do is I share myself authentically with other people. And so when it comes time to sell books, when it comes time to not sell books to the bookstore, but actually sell a book to a publisher, the publisher knows that I'm bringing a bunch of people with me on this journey. That Matt has a bunch of people. He has a crew of people who read his stuff all the time. And I produce a lot of stuff. And so they can look and say, oh, look, he has great engagement on social media. You know, and he has a newsletter that, you know, thousands of people subscribe to, and half of them actually open his newsletter. You know, and if you can find a way to get yourself on stages for other things, which I've done to a great effect, but I realize is not within everyone's capability, but if you can just get your voice out there and find that crew of people, then when it comes time to sell a book, your chances are much higher because they understand that you're bringing readers with you. It's different than it used to be. I mean, in a lot of ways, we can lament the fact that, you know, when people like Hemingway were publishing, right? They could write their books, send them off to New York, and everything was taken care of. And you know, they didn't need to respond to the reader on Twitter who said, "I loved your book." They didn't have to go and say, "Thank you very much. I greatly appreciate what you said about my book," right? They didn't need to do that. But at the same time, you kind of had to be like a white man who had connections in publishing to publish a book back then, right? There weren't that many Hemingways. There weren't that many people. And you really had to be a person who understood or knew someone. There didn't get to be that many of them. You know, the advantage we have today is that we get to sort of forge a career for ourselves that Hemingway didn't need to. And there were a lot of people like us in Hemingway's day who didn't get to because we didn't write what we thought, what New York editors thought was popular, or we were not, you know, arrogant white men producing work and getting arrogant white men in the publishing agencies to say, yes, this is very good, right? So although there's more work involved, and although I'm talking about sort of, you know, a lot of things that are not about writing, it's a lot about standing in front of people and getting them to appreciate you and listen to you and believe in you. I do think there are a lot of advantages because we get to find readers in ways that Hemingway didn't. Every time I get my books are published around the world, and every time I get an email, and it's just about once a day, where someone from another country writes to me, and I get to write back to that person, often using Google Translate to figure out what the hell they said, and then to hopefully say something that is mildly, you know, palatable and comprehensible to them. I always think Hemingway didn't get to do that. Like, you know, and he would probably say, that's fine, I got to drink more, and, you know, sit in Paris with writers and talk to them instead. But I don't know, I think it's kind of special to, you know, when a 16-year-old girl from Mexico writes to you and says she's reading your book, you know, and she can't put it down, or she wants to know what happened to the characters after the book finished. That's pretty great. But that's the idea that you put yourself out into the world and you make yourself available, and then you find your team, and then when you go to your publisher, you have a team. For me, I've had to switch publishers, and that's been really helpful to me. My first 2 books were published with Doubleday, and then that editor left Doubleday, which, if you've ever had an editor leave, you know is a disastrous situation. And so I wrote a 3rd book, and nobody wanted it. It's still sitting in a drawer. I think it's just as good as my others, but nobody wanted it. And so I had to go find a new publisher. My agent said, that's no problem, you just have to write the greatest book you'll ever write in your life, and that will allow us to find a new publisher for you. And I thought, oh, is that all I have to do? And I ended up publishing my 3rd book, Memoirs of an Imaginary Friend, which is my most successful book. It's what I wrote the best book I'll probably ever write in my life. But I needed to find a new publisher. When I went to St. Martin's, Macmillan, they knew that I had friends. They knew I had a team. They knew, like, well, people read his first 2 books, and they seem to be attached to him. And he writes a blog, and he has a newsletter, and he has a social media presence, and when he goes and he speaks, 100 people show up. I bet some of them will buy the book. All of that made a difference. And it's not because I was special, it's not because I was famous in any way, it's because I just, one meeting at a time, I would go out and share my life, and then, you know, if 2 of you, from even this conversation, if 2 of you end up being Matthew Dick's, you know, consumers of my content in the way I consume Bruce Springsteen and Stephen King and all the other people, that's great for me. You know, that's 2 more people, and you know a lot of people, and, you know, you'll probably pass my book on to someone, and maybe I'll get a couple more people. You know, there's a great article, go online and read it. It's just Google the word 1,000 fans. You know, it's the argument that if you have 1,000 devoted fans, you can have a writing career. That is what you need. You need 1,000 people who will buy everything you produce. You need more than 1,000, but that 1,000 will be enough to create a writing career for yourself. And that's not an impossible number to achieve if you can make good stuff. Again, if you don't make good stuff, I can't help you. But I can tell you to keep practicing, because it took me 17 years to publish my first book. I wrote every single day of my life without exception for 17 years before this book published. And so you might just not have practiced hard enough yet, which is a hard thing to hear, and it was a hard thing to hear for me for 17 years. But if you make good stuff, finding 1,000 people is not impossible, and finding 5,000 people is not impossible. If you're willing to be authentic and vulnerable and honest and share some of the things that I've talked about here, rather than reading your book to people, or rather even than talking about your book to people, because you really know nothing about this book other than it's written in lists. And somewhere in here there's a book, 21 Truths About Love, right? That's the only thing you really know about this book. But if I had spoken, you might even be interested in it now, but if I had crafted those stories and been a little bit more eloquent and gone into each one of them rather than touching on them, you'd want to read the book. You know, whether you're going to get it at the library or buy it at a bookstore or jump on Amazon now and pre-order it, all of those things, and yet you know nothing about the book. And yet I'm convinced that's the best way to get people interested in what you're doing. So I say get off the page and talk about yourself, talk about your process, talk about your life. If you have kids and grandchildren, you talk about them because they make you more likable. Believe me, every time I mention that I have a daughter and a son named Clara and Charlie and a wife named Alicia, it just makes me more likable. I mean, I'm sorry if you don't have any of those things, but if you do, that makes me more likable. I tell people I'm an elementary school teacher because that makes me more trustworthy, and they're like, oh, he makes no money, we've got to buy his book. He's teaching terrible children all day long, and then somehow finding a way to go home and write, that's an amazing thing. You know, I will mention things strategically in talks like I was a Boy Scout and it changed my life, particularly if there's a lot of men in the room. Because lots of men were Boy Scouts, and an instant connection in the same way. I was not in the Marines, but I see Marines have those instant connections, right? I'm constantly dropping, strategically, bits of information about myself that might mean something to other people. And in doing all of those things, I try to get as close as I can to my readers so that they feel like they know me and they're my friends. And then you touch me. You know, and then you become one of those people that come up and you touch me, even though I barely know you. And if you're rubbing my arm, you're definitely buying my book. Like, there's no way you rub my arm and not, like, click on and pre-order or go to your local indie and say, where's that Matthew Dix book, right? So if I can get you to touch me, right? It's not the way to say it, but it's true. If I can get you to touch me, you're going to buy my book. So hopefully that made some sense. I've left a little time for questions. I could take questions on this topic or anything. And so, the first reading I ever gave, the first time I ever spoke to readers, I was at a library in my hometown, my hometown where I grew up, and a woman in the back of the room, she said, the first question I've ever received was, tell me what role your ex-girlfriends play in your fiction. And that was the first question I ever gotten, so I just thought, like, wow, they ask you crazy stuff, I guess. I've never gotten that question since, but I said to the woman, I said, why do you ask me that question? And she said, you look like the kind of guy who has a lot of ex-girlfriends. Which, to this day, I don't know which way that goes, right? That is either a positive or a negative, depending on how you take it. But I loved the question because it allowed me to tell stories about my ex-girlfriends. And so if you ask me a question, if one of you has a question, I promise you I'm going to answer it in a story. And it's going to be another opportunity for me to share a little bit of myself and perhaps get a little closer to you. And so as you become more experienced doing events like this, you get the same questions, a lot of them. And you get excited when you don't. You get excited when someone asks you something crazy because it's new and interesting. But the other thing that you can sort of start working on for yourself is good answers to the typical questions that you get. And depending on what you write and who you are, your questions are going to be different. But you're going to get sort of the same dozen questions at a lot of the events you do. And if you can have a story for every question that you are asked, that's going to be really meaningful to people too. It's just another opportunity to sort of make a connection that wasn't made before. So I like crazy questions. So like I said, I'd be happy to take questions on this topic or any topic whatsoever if you have any. Yes?
Slam, could you talk about that, New York City? Because I didn't understand, I know that you've been a champion with that.
Right.
What is that about?
So the moth is a, I don't know my camera, I should not move. I tend to move, but it's fine. I'll stay right here. You can watch the clock. The Moth is a storytelling organization. It's international now. It is true stories told on stage, live, without notes. So I was there 2 nights ago in New York City. I stood on a stage, and it's a competition. And so I told a story a couple nights ago about attempting to make an avocado melt for my then girlfriend and failing. That is essentially the story that I told, and it was the discovery that I didn't need to pretend to be someone I was not. When you find the right person, it turns out you just get to be yourself, even if yourself is an unfortunate human being. And that was the discovery I made that night when my now wife discovered what was an avocado melt, or attempted to be. I didn't know how to open an avocado at the time. I had never held an avocado in my life, and so I was trying to peel it. And then I called a friend, and she said, you don't peel avocados, get a knife, and I cut the avocado, and I described what was inside, and she said, it's not ripe. I discovered the truth of the avocado, which is it's only ripe for about 9 seconds of its entire existence. I said, how do I ripen it? Can I put it in a microwave, run it under hot water? She said, no, you're just screwed. You can't do it. And I said, but she's coming over. It's the first meal I'm ever going to make for her in my entire life. The woman I love, she doesn't love me. I want her to be something that I am not so she can love that thing and then be forced to live with it forever. And my friend said, you're screwed, I'm sorry. And then they knock on the door, and she walks in, and I say, I'm sorry, I was going to make you an avocado melt, but I didn't understand the inner workings of avocado. It has a pit in the middle, by the way. Who knew? I didn't know. And then there was the lemon with the zester, and I didn't know what zesting was either. I hadn't even gotten to that step yet. But the menu, the recipe for the avocado melt, I had been at a restaurant called Martin's in the Berkshires, and she had told me while we were having breakfast that this place has the best avocado melt in the world. And so I had called Martin's when I got home and asked for the recipe. And this was like 16 years ago when you couldn't just take a picture of a recipe and text it to me. You had to like use a phone as a phone and call someone who you didn't know, and they had to on a photocopy machine and put a stamp in it. All of that, and that all happened. And my now wife was just so impressed that I had listened to her and had made the effort to get the recipe. It didn't matter that I couldn't make an avocado melt or open an avocado. It mattered that I was listening. That's all she cared about. So I told that story. It worked out well. I won. But that's what I do. I stand on a stage, I tell a story like that, 10 other people do, one of us is declared the winner. And then if you win, you get to go to a Grand Slam championship. So all of that sort of happens, and now my wife and I, we produce shows in Connecticut, Speak Up. We have an organization where we have where storytelling is told. We produce shows in Hartford and occasionally in New Haven, where we curate shows. People come and we teach them how to tell stories, or I teach them how to tell stories, and then we put them on stages, and I tell a story at every event as well. Another way to connect to other human beings. So that's what I do. It's not necessary for publishing, but it is a great way to get yourself out there and get to be known. I mean, the book I wrote, my nonfiction title is Storyworthy. It's a book about how to tell stories. It's semi-autobiographical, but it's my journey through storytelling and how I now teach people all over the world to tell personal stories, whether it's corporations or individuals or entertainers or attorneys or clergy. I could do it for a living if I want, and my wife is trying to get me to do that. But it's another opportunity, so you should be looking for opportunities to speak in front of people, regardless of what that venue might be. For me, it's storytelling, and it's things like TED Talks and inspirational speeches, but maybe for you, you're a historian, and you can go to local historical societies and offer talks, or you are a doctor who can offer, medical advice at conferences, wherever you can go, whatever you do, I'm sure you have something that you can go and do, and it's that opportunity to talk. So I stand on stages and I tell stories about me. Does that help? Yes. They have it in New York, they have it in Boston, these slams, they're open mics, you drop your name in a hat and you hope your name gets pulled out. So anyone can do it. I didn't want to do it when I started doing it. My friend said, you'll be great at this, and I said, I don't want to go tell stories to hipsters in New York with side-eye who are not going to like me. And thankfully I listened to them, and I said I'm going to do it once and never do it again, and now it's what I do mostly now. So find ways to speak, find ways to get on stages or to stand in front of people, essentially. You just want to stand in front of people and be yourself, and that's how people will connect with you. Yes?
You seem quite energetic. Do you sleep much?
The book I'm writing right now, the nonfiction book I'm writing the proposal for, is called Some Days Today, which is the idea that we have to get a lot of stuff done because our time is limited. So I don't sleep a lot, but very briefly, because I really like this topic a lot. I sleep 5 or 6 hours a night, but like most people, I take my sleep very seriously. And so when I speak to people about sleep, because I do think it's a fascinating topic, the way I sleep, if I sleep 5 hours, what I'm saying is I get into bed, and within 30 seconds I'm asleep. And I wake up without an alarm, and I pop out of bed, and I instantly get up. And now that sounds crazy, but whenever I speak to people, I say, well, are you using a white noise machine to start? And so they say no, and I say, you're not even trying. Like if you don't understand the value of a white noise machine on 3 different levels of your sleep, you're not even taking your sleep seriously at all. But you read in bed. If you're reading in bed, you're treating sleep terribly. If you're looking at your phone while you're in bed, if you have a TV in your bedroom, if you're doing any of those things, don't even talk to me about sleep, because you have thrown sleep on the floor and stepped on it and turned it into nothing, right? So although I sleep 5 to 6 hours a night, which is less than most people, and that's true, I have some energy, I treat it sacredly. And so, my wife will say she needs 8 hours of sleep, but I will say, honey, you were not asleep for 8 hours, because you were on your phone when I fell asleep. And you tossed and turned for an hour after snooze alarm. And if you use a snooze alarm, please don't even talk to me. Again, you're disregarding sleep, you're treating it like trash. So there's lots of ways where you can, I know I'm very passionate about this, but I am. There's lots of ways where you can sleep less by being more efficient and being more serious about your sleep. And so if you want to actually sleep less, which I think is great because it means you get more life, but sleep is important and I value it enormously. You have to take it very seriously. There's some good reading on it. The book Someday is Today, and then when that book comes out, it's going to have a whole chapter on sleep. And it's going to talk about all the things you can do to be more efficient in your sleeping. Sorry, I got a little.
How do you know she was tossing and turning if you were asleep?
There are people who have problems with sleep, and I don't discount the problems with sleep, but a lot of the people who tell me they have problems with sleep, they're not using white noise, they use snooze alarms, they read in bed, they look at their phones in bed, and they have a television in their bedroom. And all 5 of those things immediately discount any sleep problems in my mind because you haven't even begun to try to sleep well if you have any of those 5 things. Eliminate those 5 things from your life, or fix those 5 things in your life, you'll sleep better, I promise you. You might not fix your problem, but you will do better with your sleep, and that's important. Anything else?
Is there any part of your journey, Matt, that you would say you would have done differently in writing?
Yeah, I would have tried. That's hard to say. I wish I had found the way that I was supposed to write earlier. I went to college for creative writing, Trinity College, and I believed that the way you write is that you get an idea for a novel, and then you think about the plot, and you think about your characters and your themes. I used to have Post-it notes, I'd put them up on a whiteboard and plan the whole thing out, and then it would be nothing. It would be terrible. I'd write 50 pages, I'd at least recognize that it was crap and stop. That's a good thing to be able to do, to recognize when you're writing crap. And then one day when I was in Boca Raton at Nana's house, my wife's grandmother, and I was exceptionally bored with nothing to do because she had no Wi-Fi and I didn't rent a car, so I was trapped in this elderly compound. It was miles to get to a Target, and that was all I could. I used to do it. I'd walk to Target just because it wasn't Nana's house. I had an idea for a story about a woman who I had a friend named Justine. Actually, the woman who gave me the avocado advice told me I was screwed. Justine had opened her jewelry box one day and discovered that one of her earrings was missing, but not the other. She came to dinner upset. And I said, well, maybe someone stole one of those earrings, but left the other one in there so you would never know that they had been in your house. And I thought, oh, that'd be an interesting character, right? Somebody who does that. And so in Boca Raton, without any Post-it notes or any planning and really bored, I told my wife, I'm going to write a short story about a guy who steals one earring from as many women as he can. And that becomes Something Missing, my first novel. It's the first time I write without a plan. I write in the dark. It's the first time I discovered how I'm supposed to write. Now, I went to college for writing, and no one told me that that's how people write. That's about how half the writers in the world write. We don't know what the hell we're doing. We just say, hey, let's see what's going to happen. It's almost as if I'm reading books while I'm writing them. There's been moments when I cry in books because I am so surprised and moved by the things happening on the page, which theoretically are things that I am making up. But I believe that's, sort of coming from the back of the brain instead of the front of the brain. There are front of the brain writers, I was on a panel once with a man named Ben Dolnick, who's a great writer. And they said, where'd you get your idea for your last book? And Ben said, he said it like this, he goes, well, I was thinking of taking a Proustian approach to my book and looking at the way that society impinges on the identity of man and how you try to push against society in order to be yourself while society pushes back. He said, but then I had read the short stories of Alice Munro, and I reconsidered that and thought about the way that family can impose certain structures and limitations on human beings. And then he turned to me and said, what did you do, Matt? And I said, I don't know, I just thought I'd write a kind of a funny story, maybe that would make people cry at the end, maybe. But I just kind of made some stuff up and hoped that it would all wrap up well. I wish I had known that earlier. You know, I wish someone had told me that you just can, you don't have to have a plan, and sometimes a plan's the worst way to write. So I wish I had figured that out earlier, because I probably would have published earlier. But then again, if I had published earlier, that might have been crap. You know, my friend Plato said that I could never publish a book before I was 40, because no good books are ever published by anyone younger than 40. And I published this at 36, which allowed me to say, I told you so, which I've already told you are my 4 favorite words in the world. And he agreed. He was like, that is a great book, and you did it at 36. So maybe I needed to be 36. But I wish I had figured it out. I wish I had been more experimental early on. You know, I wish I had not tried to sort of just follow the path that I thought was supposed to be, and had tried things. So I guess that's the way I would have altered it. But it's worked out good. You know, it's working out well. I'm happy. Anything else? Yes?
I have 2 questions.
Yeah.
I write a whole panoply of things, including songs, including jokes, including short stories, including spiritual wisdom, including lots of stuff. And I don't know how to begin to make a presence because I do so many different things. And you talked about social media. If I start to do things on social media, I don't know, people aren't going to know who I am.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know where to start or how to build an image for myself, because if I do all of it, people are going to be like, is he the comedian, is he the singer, is he the one-man show performer, is he the spiritual guide, and I don't know what to do about
I
that.
think you do it all.
Do it all at
I
the same
do.
time?
So I'm an author, and I'm an elementary school teacher, and I'm a columnist, and I'm a minister, and I'm a wedding DJ, and I'm a speaking coach, and I'm an inspirational speaker, and that's just the beginning of all the crazy things that I do. You know, my wife says I have 14 jobs. And I don't attempt to be one thing, I just put it all out there. Like if you follow my social media, let's say you go on Twitter, right? And you're like, who is this person on Twitter? You're going to see photos of my children, which people actually oddly like. You'll see photos of signs that I think are very amusing. You will see photos of things that I think are beautiful. I was one of the 21 people who sued Donald Trump to get unblocked on Twitter and successfully sued him. So you will see a lot of angry responses to Donald Trump on Twitter, which my agent says sometimes, you know, you're going to turn off some of the people. And I say, I just don't think those people are reading my novels right now. You know, I just don't think anyone who wants to say terrible things to me on the internet are really going to go out and read my book. I just don't think that's the case. And I'm being authentic and true. So, you know, even if I am losing readers, I think I'm gaining others by being myself. So, but, you know, you wouldn't know where, I was ministering a wedding 2 weeks ago for one of my former students, and that would have popped up on Twitter. So I just think you'd be all of it, you know, because I don't think anyone's really one thing. I think especially in today's gig economy,
Right.
like we do a lot of stuff, and just allowing you to be all those things, I think that makes you a more interesting person. I genuinely believe that. I believe that the more we do and the more we say and the more paths we have, the more opportunities we have to connect. I think if you shored one off, you lose the opportunity. If I'm following you on social media and I find out that you're a joke writer and a songwriter and a spiritual guide, I'm not going to say, screw him, spiritual guide, that sounds stupid, right? Because it's easy to just go, oh, there's his spiritual guide stuff, I don't read that. But there's the joke, he is funny, I'm going to give him that, right? So I just think I would do it all.
Because so many people say you have to do one thing and one thing only, otherwise people don't know who you are.
Right, yeah.
And that just will never work for me. So
Well,
I'm very happy to hear what
if you
you're saying.
genuinely want people to know who you are, right? When people say they won't know who you are, what they're really saying is you have to limit who you are so people
Right.
will know who you are.
Right.
And that doesn't actually make sense to me,
Right.
Right? And I just don't think people are like that. There's not a lot of people who are one thing in the world today. And in fact, I just think that sounds kind of crazy. So I think you should be who you are. and just be all of those things. Be a complex, interesting, multifaceted human being, as we all are, and allow yourself to be that, and allow people to engage in that.
That's great, thank you.
You're welcome. You had one more?
Yeah, well, I have many.
And then we're gonna get thrown out.
Okay, the other one is, I don't send anything to like really prestigious, well, I don't send anything to anything actually. But I have very, what I think is high quality stuff. And I'm afraid to send it because, like, for instance, I have a story that people would have suggested I send to the New Yorker, right? I don't send it to the New Yorker because I think the New Yorker knows nothing about me. I need to find somebody who has a connection to the New Yorker so I get presented, at least so that they look at it. So I don't send anything anywhere because of that. And I don't know, I mean, obviously you started without a publisher.
Right.
So I'm just wondering, like, do you just send things out cold as much as you can and just hope that somebody reads it? Or how do you get, like, the little connection that somebody will go like, oh, this is maybe interesting?
For me, it was my agent. So
Yeah.
I went and found an agent, which I found cold. I was pulled off a slush pile. She took home 100.
Pulled off of what?
A slush pile. At the agencies, if you're an unsolicited manuscript, which is what I sent to 100 different literary agencies, the slush pile is, all right, you know, young agent, here's 50 unsolicited manuscripts, take them home for the weekend and read them, see if you find anything that is worthy. And, you know, 99.9% of those are tossed aside. And she found mine and said, I like what he writes. And she's my agent to this day. She's my hero, my superhero, my friend, my creative partner. And so, but that was out into the world cold. You know, I've also written for magazines by sending things out into the world cold. Just, you know, here it is. I mean, your choices are you could keep waiting and then die. Or
I'm not going to die.
Or you could, I'm not going to either actually. Or you could risk rejection.
Right.
Right?
Right.
I would say risk rejection. A no from the New Yorker on one piece does not mean a no on all pieces. You know, it's just a no for that one. And then, you know, my strategy on magazines is always I start at the top and then I work my way down. You know, so I just wrote a modern love column. You know, it almost made it, and then he said, no, we're not going to use it. That's what I'm shooting for. I want a modern love column, right? He says no. I go, all right. You know what? I can get into Parents Magazine at that. Right, and that would be pretty good. And if it doesn't get into Parents Magazine, eventually it filters down to, fine, I'll put it on my blog. You know, fine, 8,000 people can read it on my blog, right? That's the bottom of that's the bottom layer of my public, but that's what I do with everything that I work on, you know. I have short stories that I've sent out cold to many, many publishers. I found that I think is so good, nobody wants it. But every year, I refresh their memory. Hey, by the way, you said no to this last year, but I know that things change, and there's probably a new editor, and there's probably new writers, so take a look at it again. Nobody ever has written back and said, stop sending that, we read it last year. I've never gotten that, you know. And I've been through enough editors to tell you they change over.
Like, would you publish something that you think is very high quality on your blog?
If I can't get it published, yeah, because I know I can get 8,000 people to read it.
Right,
You know.
but I mean the fact that it's there, can somebody steal it or can somebody?
No, I mean I can write on a napkin and it's copyrighted for me.
Just the fact that it's on the napkin?
Yeah, once you write something, you own it, yeah.
Okay.
So I mean, someone could steal it. My father-in-law says this to me all the time. Someone could steal that. I mean, and then what would they do? They'd publish it somewhere, and I'd eventually find out about it, and I'd just get all the money, and not have to go through the effort of publishing it, and then I'd get it back, and I get to get money again when I publish it. I'm like, that sounds fine. They could steal my thing for a year, and then I'll go through that problem. My agent will do it for me, but yeah, I wouldn't worry about that. Again, you can worry and die, or you can take a risk
Right.
and hope for the best. And I think you should take the risk. I think you should get to work right away on that. You know, I waited a long time. I was nervous and I waited, and I just, you know, like I said, the one thing I would probably do is I'd be more experimental and more daring early on in my career. So go do that and get an agent. That'll help. An agent changes everything.
Yeah.
You know, and again, I sent it out to 100 different agents, and I had the second 100 ready to go when I got my agent.
Meaning they're listed, I'm sorry, I'm just...
The Writer's Market is a book you want to get. The Writer's Market, it lists all of the agents in the country and says what they're looking for.
Okay.
I went through the Writer's Market. I found the agents who were most likely to enjoy the book that I had written. And then I internet stalked them before the internet was really like a super internet thing that it is today, to figure out exactly who they were. And then I wrote a specific letter to each agent. Every agent got a different letter tailored exactly to who they were, what they liked, where they lived, everything I could find out about them without sounding creepy. But my agent teaches how to get agent workshops, and she uses my letter. She said that letter was just perfect, because I knew everything about her. I knew all the things that she had worked on before, I knew where she lived, I knew how old she was, and I just knew everything about her, so that letter just spoke to her. But I did it 100 times. It was a full-time job for me. I did it 40 hours a week during my entire summer vacation. 8 weeks, 40 hours a day. 40 hours a week for 8 weeks. And that's how I managed to get my agent. I meet a lot of people who go, well, I've queried 10 agents. They all said, no, what am I supposed to do now? I said, well, I was on number 200 when I found my agent. So go away and talk to me when you put in a great, strong effort. But get an agent. They just become your hero. They're the best.
Okay.
It's the best thing in the world to have an agent. Yes. Taryn, I love you. All right, we're going to get kicked out. I thank you for being here tonight. It was always a joy to speak to people about my books and my writing, and enjoy the Patriots tonight. If you're not a Patriots fan, there's still time to fix yourself and become a better person. Okay, that is the team to love. Thank you very much.
Thank you.